The call came at 2:17 in the morning, and I know the exact time because I'd been awake anyway, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, waiting for nothing in particular the way you do when you're 63 and sleep doesn't come as easy as it used to. It was my daughter-in-law. She was crying before she finished saying my name. My son had collapsed at work. Something with his heart. They'd taken him by ambulance to Mercy General, and she was already there, and could I please come? And her voice broke on that last word, in a way that made me push back from the table before she'd even finished the sentence. I don't remember putting on my shoes. I remember the parking lot of Mercy General at 2 in the morning. How the fluorescent lights made everything look the color of old paper. I remember the smell of the waiting room, antiseptic and burnt coffee, and something underneath both of those things that I've never been able to name, but that I associate entirely with fear. My son was in surgery when I arrived. My daughter-in-law was sitting in a plastic chair with her coat still on, her hands wrapped around a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. She stood up when she saw me, and I held her for a long time without saying anything, because there wasn't anything to say. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I assumed it was my wife. We'd been married 31 years, and she knew I'd gotten the call, and I figured she was checking in, asking for an update. Asking if I needed her to come. I stepped away from my daughter-in-law and looked at the screen. It wasn't an update. It wasn't a question. It was a notification from our joint checking account. A transfer. $47,000, moved to an account I didn't recognize, time-stamped 11 minutes ago. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. The number didn't change. I stood in the middle of a hospital waiting room at 2:30 in the morning, my son in surgery on the other side of a set of doors I wasn't allowed through, and I stared at a number on my phone that didn't make any sense. I called her. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text. What is this transfer? Call me. I watched the screen. The little check marks appeared. She'd read it. No response. My daughter-in-law touched my arm and asked if I was okay, and I told her yes, just a bank thing. Don't worry about it. And I put the phone back in my pocket and I sat down next to her, and I did not think about the money for the next 4 hours because my son was the only thing that mattered, and I have never in my life been more grateful for something requiring my full attention. The surgeon came out at 6:42. Stable. A blockage. Caught in time. Stent placed. He'd need rest and monitoring, but he was going to be okay. My daughter-in-law made a sound I'd never heard a person make before, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, and I put my arm around her, and for a moment everything else fell away entirely. Then I took out my phone again. No calls. No texts. Just the original notification, sitting there. I tried my wife one more time. Voicemail. I drove home at 7:15, after my son was moved to a room, and my daughter-in-law had called her own mother, and there were enough people present that I wasn't leaving her alone. I told her I'd be back by noon. She hugged me at the elevator and said thank you for coming so fast, and I thought about the fact that my wife had not come at all. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when someone has recently left them, not the quiet of early morning, which has a kind of stillness to it, something emptier than that. Her closet was open. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and looked at it. Half the hangers were bare. Her overnight bag was gone. The framed photo of us at Yellowstone, the one that had sat on her nightstand for 11 years, was gone. On the kitchen counter, she'd left a single piece of paper. I've been unhappy for a long time. I need to start over. Don't try to find me. I'll be in touch about the rest. That was it. No signature. No explanation of the $47,000. No mention of the fact that our son had been in surgery while she was packing her things and emptying our account. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I'm not sure why the floor specifically. I think my legs just stopped working, and the floor was where I ended up. I sat there for a while, with my back against the cabinet under the sink and the note in my hand, and the refrigerator humming above me, and I tried to put together a timeline in my head. She'd known about our son before she left. I'd called her from the hospital parking lot. She'd answered that time, actually answered, and said, "Okay, keep me posted." And her voice had been calm in a way I'd registered as composure, but now understood as something else entirely. She had answered the phone, said she'd keep updated, then packed a bag, transferred our savings, and walked out of the house while I sat in a waiting room, not knowing if my son was going to make it through the night. I called my brother first. He's 2 years younger than me, lives about 40 minutes away, and he has always been the person I call when I don't know what to do next. He answered on the second ring even though it was barely 7:30, and I told him what had happened. The money, the note, the bare hangers. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Come over right now." And I said, "I need to call an attorney first." And he said, "Okay, then come over right after." I didn't know a family law attorney personally. I'd never had reason to. I found one by calling a colleague I trusted who'd gone through a divorce 3 years prior, and even though it was early, he texted me back within minutes with a name and a number, and the words, "Call her today, she's the best." Her name was Patricia Okafor. I called at 8:05 and left a message, and she called back by 8:40, which I later came to understand was not standard practice, but reflected the particular urgency of what I'd described in the voicemail. I told her about the transfer first. $47,000 from our joint checking. She asked if I had online access to the account, and I said yes, and she told me to log in while she stayed on the line. The money was gone, not to an account in my wife's name, at least not any account I recognized. When I told Miss Okafor this, she asked me to take screenshots of everything and not to touch the account, not to move anything, not to try to reverse the transfer on my own. Then she asked about other accounts. We had a joint savings, a money market account, a brokerage account I'd opened 15 years ago that we'd both been contributing to. I checked the savings while she waited. $11,000, gone. Same timestamp. The money market was untouched. The brokerage I couldn't access quickly from my phone, and she told me to call the brokerage directly as soon as we hung up and to flag potential unauthorized transfers. We talked for 45 minutes. By the end of it, I understood several things I had not understood at the beginning of the call. 1. My wife had transferred marital funds without my consent, which in our state constituted financial misconduct in a divorce proceeding. 2. The note she'd left, while not a legal document, established intent to abandon the marriage and could be relevant. 3. I needed to file first, and I needed to do it quickly, and I needed to do it before she did. Miss Okafor's office would draft the filing that afternoon. I drove to my brother's house, and he made eggs and didn't ask me too many questions, and let me sit at his kitchen table for 2 hours just existing, which is what I needed more than anything else. At noon, I went back to the hospital. My son was awake. He was pale and tired, and there were wires attached to him in 4 places, and he looked younger than his 38 years in a way that made my chest tighten, in a way that had nothing to do with anger. My daughter-in-law was on one side of the bed. I sat on the other. We talked about nothing important for a while. The nurses, the food, whether the game had been on in the recovery room. He looked at me at some point and said, "Where's Mom?" I told him she'd had to handle something and would be in touch soon. My daughter-in-law met my eyes over the bed, and I shook my head very slightly, and she looked down at her hands. It was not the right moment to tell him. There would be a right moment later. That was not it. I drove home that evening and found a missed call from a number I didn't recognize, with a Vegas area code. She picked up when I called back. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask about our son. She said she wanted me to know she was safe, and that she'd be consulting her own attorney, and that she hoped we could handle things like adults. I asked her if she knew our sons had been in surgery. A pause. She said she knew. and that she was glad he was okay. I asked her if she understood that she had emptied our joint accounts while he was in surgery. She said the money was hers too, and that she'd needed it. I didn't say what came into my mind. I have been around long enough to know that there are moments when what comes into your mind should stay exactly there. I told her my attorney would be in contact, and I ended the call. My hands were not entirely steady when I put the phone down. What I didn't know then, and what I would piece together over the following 2 weeks, was that she hadn't gone alone. She had gone with a man I knew, not well, but I knew him. He was the husband of a woman in her book club. He'd been at our house for a dinner party twice in the last year. I'd thought of him as pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of person you talk to about sports for 10 minutes at a gathering, and don't particularly think about again. I found this out the way you find most things out. Through a friend who'd heard from another friend, who'd seen them at an airport together 3 days before my son collapsed. The timeline, once I looked at it, made my stomach drop. She'd known for months, maybe longer. The book club trips that ran longer than expected. The weekend she'd visited her college friend in Phoenix. The friend, it turned out, barely knew her anymore and hadn't seen her in almost 2 years. Ms. Okafor found all of this relevant. She also found relevant something I hadn't thought to look for. A second transfer, smaller, made 6 weeks prior. $3,000 to the same unrecognized account. A test run, she said. The way you'd test a door before you decide to walk through it. The financial picture that emerged over the next month was complicated, but not as complicated as my wife had perhaps hoped. The marital home was in both our names. The brokerage account, which she had not successfully accessed, contained significantly more than what she had managed to transfer. Her attempt to drain the liquid accounts while leaving the larger assets untouched reflected either a miscalculation or a plan that hadn't fully come together before she'd had to move. Miss Okafor filed for divorce within 48 hours of our first call. She moved to freeze remaining joint assets pending resolution. The transfer, documented with timestamps, became a central exhibit in the financial misconduct claim. My wife's attorney sent a letter proposing mediation. Miss Okafor advised me to decline. I declined. The weeks that followed had a quality I can only describe as suspended. I went to the hospital every day until my son was released. I had dinner with my brother twice a week. I went to work because work requires you to show up and focus on something other than your own life, and I found I was grateful for that requirement. I called Miss Okafor every time I had a question, and she answered most of them within the business day, and slowly, incrementally, I began to understand the shape of what was happening. My son was home within 10 days. He called me the evening he was discharged from his couch with his wife next to him, and he told me he loved me, and I told him I loved him, and then he asked about his mother again. I told him then. I kept it simple. I told him the marriage had ended, that there had been dishonesty on her part over a period of time, that his mother and I would be going through a legal process, and that none of it was about him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She wasn't here when I was in the hospital." I said, "I know." He said, "You were here the whole time." I said, "Yes." He said he'd call me tomorrow, and we hung up. My daughter-in-law texted me an hour later, just to say thank you again for those nights, and I looked at that message for a while before I put the phone down. Here is what I have come to understand about the months that followed, having lived through them. Legal processes are slow, and they should be, and the slowness is sometimes maddening and sometimes a mercy. There is a lot of waiting. There are a lot of documents. There are moments of apparent progress, followed by weeks of apparent nothing, and you learn to measure time differently, to assess things not in days but in increments. The forensic accountant Ms. Okafor brought in traced both transfers. The destination account was in my wife's name only, opened 8 months prior. The financial misconduct claim held The court issued an order requiring the transferred funds to be returned to a joint account pending final resolution. And while it took longer than I would have liked, the order was complied with. The brokerage account, which she had attempted to access on 3 separate occasions in the 2 days before she left, remained intact because she'd been unable to complete the security verification. I had set up 2-factor authentication years ago at the insistence of my son, who works in tech and has opinions about online security, and it is not an exaggeration to say that his habit of sending me articles I didn't always read may have preserved a significant portion of our marital estate. The divorce was finalized 9 months after she left. It was not a clean line. There is no clean line, I think, when something ends that began 31 years ago. But it was a line. Ms. Okafor called me when the final order was signed, and her voice had the particular quality of professional satisfaction, and I thanked her more sincerely than I have thanked many people in my life. What I did not do in those 9 months was contact my wife outside of what the attorneys required. What I did not do was explain myself to her, or justify my decisions, or ask her to account for hers. I had said what I had to say on the night of the phone call from Vegas. After that, there was nothing. My son recovered fully. The cardiologist said the blockage, caught when it was, had left no lasting damage. He went back to work in 6 weeks. He and his wife came for Thanksgiving. The first Thanksgiving I'd hosted alone in more than 3 decades. And my brother and his family came, and it was loud in the way that good dinners are loud, and quiet in the ways that I have made peace with. After dinner, my son and I stood on the back porch with our coffees cooling in our hands, watching the neighbor's dog chase something around the yard next door, and he said, "I never told you this, but I remember you being there." In the hospital, I don't remember a lot about those first 2 days. But I remember you being in the chair when I opened my eyes. I didn't say anything. He said, "That's the whole thing, actually. That's all I needed to know." The chair on the porch where I'm sitting right now belonged to my father. He brought it home when I was about 12 years old, and it has moved with me to 3 different houses since then. The wood is worn smooth in the places where you rest your hands. I sit in it most evenings when the weather allows, with whatever is left of my coffee, watching the light change over the backyard, and I have found that it is a good place to be present in, without needing to be anything else. I am 63 years old. I sleep better than I used to. I do not check the joint account anymore, because there is no joint account anymore, just my own, which I monitor with perhaps more attention than strictly necessary, but which brings me a specific, reliable satisfaction. Each time, the balance is exactly what I expect it to be. My son calls every Sunday. My daughter-in-law sends me recipes she thinks I'll like, and occasionally I make them, and occasionally they are even good. My brother comes over every few weeks, and we watch whatever game is on, and don't feel the need to fill the silence. This is the thing I couldn't have told you a year ago. Sitting in that hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee and a notification on my phone that didn't make sense. That the worst night of my life was also, in some way I'm still working out. The night things became clear. Not easy, not fixed, but clear. My son was in the chair when I opened my eyes. That's the whole thing, actually. That's all I needed to know.